Our nation faces a crisis along the southern border, and I'm working with local leaders in Arizona, my colleagues in Congress and the administration, to stop the flow of migrants to the southern border and ensure the fair and humane treatment of migrants who do come. The situation on the ground with our communities, NGOs, and our border workforce is not sustainable, so we must work together to find bipartisan and common sense solutions. Acting Secretary, I'm glad you're here today, and I look forward to our discussion. The lack of transportation resources to manage the flow of migrants is a serious problem in Arizona. We need help transporting migrants between interception, detention facilities, and ICE, and getting migrants to NGOs to facilitate further transportation. Could you review DHS's capability to provide additional transportation resources in Arizona, including resources from outside CBP or ICE, and get back to me on what the possibilities are?
I can do that.
Great. This is going well, Chairman. When searching for solutions to a crisis, it's always important to think outside the box, and I hope that you're encouraging your organization to tackle the challenges with the migrant crisis in this manner. I think the transportation issue calls for some outside-the-box thinking. It's in DHS's best interest to work with the NGO groups on how best to manage migrant transportation after they leave DHS custody. But I've heard from some constituents about ideas such as working with sponsors to fund charter bus routes to ease the pressure on crowded Greyhound routes. Such ideas have merit, but will probably need DHS assistance and cooperation to be effective. Could you also take a creative look at what other support DHS could provide to these NGOs on the transportation front and work with us on the ground in Arizona on those possibilities?
Yeah, we'll do that, Senator. I think innovation and partnership are going to be critical as we're managing this crisis. They have been to date with state and local authorities in Arizona and elsewhere. I'll just highlight one quick example of that innovation and creativity. Our acting commissioner, John Sanders at CBP, has been instrumental in bringing together faith-based organizations and NGOs with resources away from the border that want to or are able to help the NGOs at the border that are doing so much work in your state, in El Paso, in South Texas with Sister Norma Pimentel's organization, and really that's brought in lots of additional resources and funding that's supporting the border entities. So I think we can do the same kind of thing on transportation, not only engaging our Greyhound partners to increase routes, but also look at other creative solutions. In addition to applying the funding we're getting from Congress, we're buying buses for CBP, we're borrowing CDL drivers from the Department of Defense, and we've asked for more transportation funding in the supplemental.
Great. I believe we need to treat all migrants who come to our country fairly and humanely. We also need to determine who's eligible for asylum and who comes to our country as an economic migrant. And the key part of that effort, of course, is the determination of credible fear. Do you feel that the department has sufficient authority to allow immigration and asylum officers to ask enough questions of migrants to get at the truth of any credible fear claims?
I think there's two elements to that. Resource is part of it, right? Being able to take the time at the front end to assess the situation, and we're seeing that, unfortunately, with family units right now. The volume is so high, our Border Patrol agents are not able to spend adequate time with each family to do their interviews, to assess the family relationship, or if there's any concerns of smuggling or trafficking. And I know that because we've deployed HSI agents from ICE to both El Paso and RGV over the last 3 weeks. Out of 560 interviews, they found 160 cases of fraud. Granted, these were targeted cases based on risk, based on visuals and prior interviews by Border Patrol, but that's an incredibly high percentage. And they're prosecuting the adults involved, but I'm very worried that resource-wise, we don't have enough, to your point, to detect that fraud and protect the safety of children that could be trafficked or smuggled by adults right now, given the flood of the crush. The other aspect of credible fear, though, is the standard. There's clearly too big a gap between the front-end bar on credible fear, a possibility of proving an asylum case, and the ultimate determination by a judge. To have 85 to 90% pass that first bar, but only 10 to 15% pass the asylum bar, with a 2 to 5 year gap between those two findings, that's obviously a gap in the framework that's allowing and inciting additional traffic to our border. So I think we need to address not only the resources side, but the standard.
What would you suggest that that Congress do to help close that gap between the initial interview and the determination in front of a judge?
Well, we've provided language to the Judiciary Committee in the Senate that would apply a different standard on the front end of the credible fear that we think would still allow valid asylum cases to go forward, but reduce that huge gap between the credible fear findings and the asylum findings.